The dust rises gently over Ouagadougou's parade grounds. The morning air trembles with the deep echo of marching drums. In the distance, the crowd erupts, flags waving, children perched on their fathers' shoulders. Then a voice, calm yet commanding, breaks through the roar. Burkina Faso has become a military power. At that moment, something shifts. From the midst of armored vehicles and disciplined soldiers, President Ibrahim Traoré steps forward, not as a politician hiding behind protocol, but as a soldier leading by example. He inspects each new reconnaissance vehicle himself, his hand tracing the cold steel of the machines his people built to protect their sovereignty. For years, the world has viewed Burkina Faso as a fragile nation trapped in the cycle of aid and dependency. But today, that image collapses. The young captain who once rose from the dust of Sahel now commands one of Africa's most determined armies, and he's doing it without bowing to Washington or Paris. As the engines start, the announcer's voice thunders again. 3 batteries, 6 guns each, a symbol of strength, a message to the world. This is not just a military ceremony. It is the sound of a nation reclaiming its dignity, the birth of a new African identity that refuses to kneel. And behind it all, one bold declaration stands tall. Burkina Faso will no longer accept America's injustice. We will not be the dumping ground of global inequality. But those who seek freedom are welcome here. Can a small African nation truly stand alone against the world's most powerful empire? Or has the spirit of Thomas Sankara been reborn in the voice of Ibrahim Traoré? Share this if you believe that dignity is worth more than approval. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. The morning sun over Ouagadougou cuts through the haze like a golden blade. Soldiers in crisp uniforms stand at attention, the rhythmic sound of boots striking the ground blending with the hum of engines. It is the official handover ceremony of military equipment, a moment that would redefine the nation's place in Africa and the world. Rows of armored reconnaissance vehicles glisten under the light, their surfaces freshly painted in the red, green, and gold of the Burkina Faso flag. Nearby, 3 artillery batteries, 6 heavy guns each, are positioned perfectly facing the horizon. Every barrel points not toward an enemy, but toward the future. President Ibrahim Traoré walks among them quietly, his posture straight, his eyes focused. He is not surrounded by bodyguards or foreign advisors. Instead, he is flanked by young Burkina Faso engineers, men and women in plain khaki, some no older than 25. These are the architects of the nation's new military strength. One of the engineers explains to the gathered press how the onboard computer system of each vehicle allows real-time communication between the field and the command center. We no longer need to rely on external software or foreign satellites, he says proudly. Our systems are built and maintained by Burkina Faso minds. The president listens attentively, nodding. Then, without hesitation, he climbs into one of the vehicles himself. Cameras flash. The crowd grows silent. Inside the vehicle, he presses several keys on the onboard monitor, testing, calibrating, confirming. When he steps out, the audience erupts into applause. This single gesture, a president personally testing the nation's military equipment, is loaded with meaning. For many, watching it symbolizes something the West never expected to see: an African leader who trusts his own people more than imported expertise. Behind the podium, the national broadcaster's voice echoes through the loudspeakers. 3 batteries, 6 units each, a complete system of national defense. Burkina Faso stands ready. As the applause builds, so does a quiet realization. This is not just about firepower. It's about independence, the kind that cannot be sanctioned or revoked. For decades, Burkina Faso had relied on foreign military aid, French advisors, American logistics, imported technology. But that model failed. It left the nation vulnerable, disarmed, and dependent. When Traoré took power, he made a vow: never again. Step by step, his administration rebuilt from within. Mechanics from Bobo Dioulasso learned to repair armored engines. University students in Ouagadougou trained in electronics to service radar systems. Retired officers returned to mentor the next generation of soldiers. What began as a small initiative to maintain aging vehicles has now evolved into a national program of military self-sufficiency. The announcer continues, his voice almost trembling with pride. This is not the army of yesterday. This is the people's army. It's hard to overstate what this means in a region long destabilized by coups, insurgencies, and foreign influence. For the first time, Burkina Faso's military is not fighting for someone else's interests. It's defending its own soil, its own people, and its own sovereignty. The sound of the drums returns heavy and proud. Soldiers raise their fists in salute. The national flag unfurls across the grandstand. Then, over the loudspeaker, a new message, political and raw, captures everyone's attention. Burkina Faso will not accept Washington's injustice. We are free people, and we will decide for ourselves. A wave of emotion sweeps through the audience. Some shout, some weep. Many simply stand in silence, absorbing what they are witnessing. For the older generation, it recalls the voice of Thomas Sankara. For the young, it marks the dawn of a new chapter. At that moment, under the sun of the Sahel, Burkina Faso is no longer a small landlocked country. It is a statement forged in steel discipline and faith in its own hands. The drums fell silent. Then through the echo of marching boots and the hum of engines came a single voice over the loudspeakers, calm, firm, unmistakable. Burkina Faso will not take part in the injustice imposed by the United States. For a heartbeat, the field froze. Soldiers stopped moving. Cameras stopped rolling. Even the crowd, thousands strong, went completely silent. Then slowly the applause began. It started like distant thunder, building until it shook the air. What had just happened was more than a policy statement. It was a public defiance of Washington, broadcast live across Africa. The United States had reportedly demanded that Burkina Faso accept the transfer of deported individuals, a move seen by many in Ouagadougou as disrespectful, treating their homeland as a dumping ground for unwanted people. But Traore's government said no, firmly, unapologetically, proudly. The voice of the announcer rose again, explaining the government's position in simple, powerful words. Burkina Faso will not participate in an injustice, but anyone who chooses freely to come to this land of liberty is welcome. We are not rejecting people. We are rejecting humiliation. The crowd roared. Some waved flags, others shouted the president's name. One woman in tears whispered to her son, "This is what it means to be free." On the nearby stage, journalists scrambled to capture the moment. The images would soon circle the globe, the young African president standing beside armored vehicles, rejecting the command of a superpower. Within hours, social media exploded. African activists across the diaspora posted the clip with captions like, "If they can say no to Washington, so can we." The spirit of Sankara lives again. From Lagos to Atlanta, from Nairobi to New York, people began to share the footage not because of the machines, but because of the message. And yet in Washington, the reaction was different. Unnamed State Department officials expressed concern over the tone and direction of the speech. Analysts on Western media channels tried to downplay the event, describing it as symbolic or populist. But none of that mattered to those watching in Africa. For the first time in decades, an African leader was not asking for approval, he was giving the world notice. The symbolism was powerful. Behind the tanks and the soldiers stood the young captain who had come to power promising one thing: sovereignty. And now, in broad daylight, he was delivering it in the boldest way possible by telling Washington no. A live broadcaster on the scene shouted into his microphone, his voice breaking with excitement. "Share this. Share this. Everyone. Let the world see what courage looks like." And they did. Within 24 hours, millions had viewed the clip across Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. For the African diaspora, particularly older African Americans, it struck a deep emotional chord. A retired U.S. Air Force veteran from Maryland wrote under one of the posts, "I spent my life defending freedom abroad, but it's in Africa where I finally see it being lived." This moment was not about military power anymore. It was about moral power. Traore's refusal, calm, measured, but unwavering, carried the kind of weight that speeches in air-conditioned halls rarely achieve. It was the language of conviction, not convenience. Burkina Faso was no longer playing by the rules of global obedience. It was writing its own. And in that silence between applause and anthem, one could feel something changing, not just in Burkina Faso, but in the entire continent. The spirit that once drove liberation movements in Ghana, Algeria, and South Africa was stirring again, not in whispers this time, but in engines, in chants, in the steady gaze of a leader unafraid to say, "We will not kneel." That was the climax, a declaration not just against America's decision, but against an entire world order built on compliance. And when the drums resumed, their rhythm was different, heavier, prouder, certain. The world had just witnessed Burkina Faso's defiance become its dignity. The echoes of that declaration, "We will not kneel," did not fade when the ceremony ended. They traveled across villages, cities, and screens, weaving into conversations at markets, in classrooms, and inside military barracks. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, it was not just another political speech. It was a turning point, a moment when people realized they were no longer voiceless. In Ouagadougou, students replayed the video on their phones, cheering each time Traoré said no to Washington. Farmers in Bobo Dioulasso spoke about the president's courage during evening tea, and women in Kaya said they felt safer knowing our army now belongs to us, not to foreigners. It wasn't just pride. It was ownership, the rediscovery of what it meant to belong to a sovereign nation. Within days, local radio stations and newspapers reported a surge of volunteers signing up for national defense training programs. Mechanics University graduates and even street vendors were applying to join community brigades, offering their time to maintain vehicles, translate technical manuals, or help build local infrastructure for the army. One headline captured it best. "For the first time, Burkina Faso is defended by Burkinabe hands." The civil enthusiasm was mirrored by a new kind of political maturity. Regional governors organized public forums discussing what sovereignty truly means, not as an abstract concept, but as daily responsibility. Activists urged the government to make the military program transparent to keep corruption at bay. The tone of national discourse shifted from dependence to discipline. Meanwhile, the international consequences began to unfold. In Washington, the State Department announced a review of bilateral relations with Burkina Faso. Aid programs were quietly frozen, and certain U.S.-backed NGOs suspended their operations. Western commentators accused Traoré of authoritarian populism, suggesting his policies could isolate the country. But in Africa, the opposite happened. From Bamako to Niamey, leaders of Mali and Niger publicly congratulated Burkina Faso for standing firm in the face of injustice. The AS Alliance, the security coalition of the three Sahel nations, gained a surge of legitimacy. Suddenly, the idea of collective African sovereignty felt real, not rhetorical. In the streets of Ouagadougou, murals of Traoré began to appear. In one painting, he stood with a raised fist beneath the words, "Our dignity is not negotiable." In another, he was drawn beside Sankara, symbolizing a continuation of the same unfinished revolution. Yet not everyone was comfortable. Some opposition figures inside the country warned that international isolation could hurt the economy. Others feared retaliation, sanctions, trade restrictions, or diplomatic pressure. But most Burkinabe responded with stoic calm. They had lived through worse droughts, coups, and decades of neglect. Now, at least, they felt ownership of their destiny. A retired teacher in Ouagadougou summarized the nation's sentiment in one sentence that spread across local media: "Before we feared losing aid. Now we fear losing our honor." That shift from fear of poverty to fear of shame was monumental. It marked a psychological liberation as powerful as any political reform. The ripple effects reached far beyond Burkina Faso. Young people in neighboring countries began to question the presence of foreign troops on their soil. Community radio shows debated what it would take for Africa to defend itself, not just with weapons, but with unity. And as night fell across the Sahel, an old saying resurfaced in conversations: "When one village lights its fire, the darkness cannot return." Burkina Faso had lit that fire, and this time the flame was not fueled by anger, but by dignity, discipline, and the courage to stand alone. News of Burkina Faso's defiance reached Washington before nightfall. Within hours, headlines rippled across the Atlantic. CNN ran a short piece titled, "Burkina Faso Rejects U.S. Decision Analysts Warn of Growing Tensions." Reuters used a cooler tone: "Burkina Faso distances itself from U.S. policy over deportations." But in smaller independent circles on YouTube, podcasts, and community networks, the language was very different. The Gray Zone called it a moral turning point for Africa. African Diaspora News Channel simply said Traoré stood when others bowed. And across America, something began to stir, particularly among older African Americans who had lived through the civil rights era, Vietnam, and decades of broken promises about democracy and equality. To them, Ibrahim Traoré's words didn't sound rebellious. They sounded righteous. A 68-year-old veteran from Detroit wrote online, "We once marched for freedom in Selma, and now I see a young African soldier marching for the same cause, but this time he's carrying a nation on his shoulders." For many in that generation, the Burkina Faso story cut through the fog of media narratives. It wasn't about anti-American sentiment. It was about something deeper: the right to refuse humiliation. At Georgetown University, a small panel of political scientists debated the implications. One scholar warned that the Sahel could become a new front of ideological independence. Another, more sympathetic voice argued, maybe it's time the West stops seeing African dignity as defiance. In Europe, reactions were mixed. France, still bruised by its expulsion from Sahel territories, accused Traore of radical nationalism. The European Parliament expressed concern about democratic backsliding, while independent journalists in Paris noted that the same governments preaching democracy were still selling weapons to dictatorships elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, the tone was far more pragmatic. Russian and Chinese analysts praised Burkina Faso's pursuit of sovereignty as an inevitable step toward multipolarity. Their state media highlighted the moment as evidence that the global South is awakening. But it was in Africa and among its diaspora where the reaction mattered most. In Johannesburg, students painted murals of the Burkina Faso flag beside the words "One Africa, One Voice." In Kingston, Jamaica, radio hosts drew parallels between Traore and Marcus Garvey, calling him the living echo of Africa's unfinished dream. Even in the Caribbean and Latin America, commentators recognized a pattern: the slow crumbling of the post-colonial order. For Western governments, this was unsettling. A single refusal by a small, landlocked nation had inspired an entire continent to rethink obedience. For ordinary Americans, especially those old enough to remember when moral courage mattered, it felt strangely refreshing. One retired schoolteacher from Georgia summed it up in a comment that went viral. "It's ironic. The kind of moral backbone we used to admire in our own leaders, now we're finding it in Africa." As days passed, the story faded from mainstream headlines but deepened in cultural resonance. Burkina Faso had not just rejected a U.S. policy, it had challenged a system of global submission. And as older Americans watched the images, a young African president inspecting armored vehicles under the rising Sahel sun, many found themselves asking the same quiet question: when did we stop standing for what was right? Because somewhere in the heart of West Africa, a young soldier had just reminded the world that freedom once rediscovered refuses to kneel again. The ceremony in Ouagadougou ended as it had begun, not in silence but in conviction. The final words echoed through the loudspeakers cutting across the hot Sahel air: "The homeland or death we shall overcome." The crowd stood motionless. Soldiers saluted. The drums slowed, deep and deliberate, as if the earth itself was listening. This was more than a patriotic slogan. It was an oath, a promise to never again allow foreign powers to dictate the fate of a proud African nation. For many watching across the world, it was a reminder that true independence is not declared with signatures. It is proven through sacrifice. And that day, President Ibrahim Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso had proven it. They had done what few nations dared to do. They looked the world's most powerful empire in the eye and said, "No." But this story is not just about Africa. It is about all of us, about the universal struggle for dignity, honesty, and sovereignty in a world that too often trades those values for comfort and silence. For Americans, especially those who still remember the 1960s, the marches, the wars, and the speeches that once called for moral courage, Burkina Faso's stand feels strangely familiar. It reminds us of a time when nations and people believed in something greater than fear. We are free people, and we will decide for ourselves. That sentence, simple as it sounds, carries the weight of generations from Thomas Sankara's revolution to the buried dreams of leaders across the global South. And in Ibrahim Traoré's voice, the world heard an echo of that lost courage. Still, courage comes with a cost. The days ahead for Burkina Faso will not be easy. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and political manipulation may follow, but the nation's new strength doesn't lie in weapons, it lies in conviction. The question now extends beyond the Sahel. Can the rest of the world learn from this Con America? To remember that freedom is not something to be granted, but to be lived, defended, and respected everywhere it dares to rise. Burkina Faso's defiance is not a threat. It is a mirror reflecting what humanity looks like when it refuses to kneel. So let us ask ourselves, do we stand with the nations that obey or with those that stand tall? Share this video if you believe that dignity is the foundation of freedom. Subscribe if you believe that truth must never bow to power. And remember, sometimes the smallest nations carry the loudest echoes if only the world is willing to listen.